I mentioned I'm a DevOps engineer at Peak, and today I'm going to be talking about scaling developer autonomy. So, how we can kind of bring some order to the Wild West of software development without making developers feel like they're always being told what to do. So, more specifically, I'm going to cover off kind of the pain points we've had at Peak as we've scaled, our approach to dealing with some of the problems that have arisen, and then kind of why we've used GitHub Actions and Backstage within our kind of answer to those problems, and then how those two things kind of piece together to form a kind of complete solution. So as we've scaled, we've seen kind of a few different issues. The first one is kind of like the cliched issues around communication. So as teams get larger, there's more links to manage, more communication to manage. We also have teams working in different countries, so there's a need to manage asynchronous communication as well. And also, as we've scaled, there's more information to share with new joiners, so our onboarding process becomes harder and longer as well. Some of us may be familiar with this XKCD comic about code compiling. I think these days, the same can kind of be said about a lot of deployments, especially whenever kind of code you're deploying has a lot of layers and it has a lot of infrastructure behind it. Sometimes deployments for new services can be quite time consuming. We've also found that where you have lots of teams, there is a risk as well that you end up reinventing the wheel if you don't make sure that teams communicate effectively with each other. And similarly, you have a lot of teams coming up with new ideas, which is great, but we also want to make sure that we're always managing that because otherwise we end up in situations where it doesn't all conform together really well. Whereas we want to kind of maintain a clean architecture and make sure we're keeping to engineering best practices, especially when it comes to anything around security. So a kind of answer to some of the problems I've kind of highlighted kind of has some key attributes for us. So the first is that it shouldn't introduce a hierarchy. Any tooling you roll out to engineering should kind of be used the same way, regardless of if you're the CTO or if you're kind of a junior developer. It should also be liberating for developers to use. So by that, I kind of mean that developers shouldn't feel like when they're using tools, they have to use a particular programming language or do things a particular way. That's really key to us in our approach at Peak because a lot of our developers have a lot of autonomy and we want to make sure that we're not getting in their way. For us as well, it should kind of be a single source of truth. So this kind of helps simplify that like communication network. If there's a single reliable point that people can go to for information about our services and about Peak more generally, then that is always a great thing. And it should also be really easy to use, especially when it comes to deployments. Where possible, we want to simplify deployments as much as possible, ideally getting to a point where developers can just push a button and that will roll their code out to a new service. So that then they can just build faster without things getting in their way. In essence, we want developers' experience to be more like this, kind of smooth sailing. They can just ship code quickly without too many worries, and a bit less like this, where they're getting stuck, they're worrying about why their tooling isn't working, and just getting more frustrated. So our approach combines Backstage, which is a developer portal that's open source and created by Spotify, with GitHub Actions, which is GitHub's very own CI/CD solution. So we use both of these together, and we find that they work together really well. So GitHub Actions have some key benefits. So the first big one, where GitHub has quite a relatively unique advantage compared to some other tools, is that the CI/CD sits right next to the code. So for developers, it's really easy to use. They don't have to context switch as much. They can just go straight to their code and also just jump a tab over, and all of the CI/CD pipeline is right there. There's also a huge marketplace of actions already available. So if you want to do something in a GitHub workflow, the odds are someone's already done it before. So you can either use an action that pre-exists or just look up a guide online. There's also a really flexible set of triggers available. So you can configure workflows to kind of respond to any kind of event. So be that repo creation, PR creation, pushes to new branches, and so on. So you can really be flexible in kind of what you want your workflows to do. And we've also found that they have quite a low barrier to entry. They're fairly easy to use and get up and started with. And they also scale well when you have lots of different workflows. GitHub lets you put them in lots of different files and kind of manage them independently, whereas some of the other solutions we looked at kind of forced you to have them all in one file, which kind of didn't really scale that well when we had a lot going on. There are a few gotchas just to be wary of, and just think about if you're using GitHub Actions though. The first one is around malicious actions. This isn't something we've personally run into yet, but it's just something to bear in mind that they could in theory exist, and that any code you're running that has been, any actions you're running that have been created by other people could potentially be malicious, and you are giving them access to your code base and other things. The other issue we have actually run into around that, though, is around unsupported actions. So there has been one case where we've started using an action we found really useful for deploying CloudFormation stacks, and then realized it had been archived and we'd found a bug with it. And there was actually a pull request on the action to fix it, but since it had been archived, that PR was never going to get approved, which is kind of slightly annoying for us. It is also easy to run into situations where once you've got kind of quite a big piece of software and a lot going on with it, you can run into some quite complex workflows. So you do just need to be careful about how you manage those. Maybe try and break them down into separate workflows where you can. Also, by default, GitHub Actions run on semi-public infrastructure. So just bear that in mind about where and what you're running and what access you're giving to your code base. And also, there's kind of some slight annoyance at the moment around new workflows. If you create a new workflow on a new branch and you want to kind of trigger it manually, you can't trigger it manually until it exists in some form on the main branch of your repo. So that's just something to bear in mind if you've kind of run into that issue. Similarly with Backstage, there's loads of benefits. The first one is that it allows you to track everything. So you can register all sorts of different entity types in Backstage, including APIs, services, websites, libraries, any sorts of components. It lets you track the relationships between them. So if you create a new service, you can track kind of what APIs it consumes or what APIs it provides. And you can also track what teams own a new service as well. Backstage also provides really useful templating engine, and this has kind of been key to our approach. So we're currently rolling out a new template for developers to use so that they can kind of get their services up and running really quickly. And Backstage lets us kind of make the kind of use of that really easy. Backstage also allows kind of any developer in your team to kind of contribute. Anyone could go into a Backstage instance and kind of add new plugins and kind of get them up and running. So you can really distribute kind of the work on your developer portal so that everyone feels like they can contribute to it. It's also got some really great integrations with tools like GitHub Actions and like Circle CI, which allow it to show the state of various deployments. And it's got a really active and really fun community around it. So the likes of like Monzo and Splunk, as well as Spotify themselves, are really very active. And there's loads of community contributors that are helping it grow really rapidly. So there's a couple of gotchas around Backstage as well. The first is that it's being constantly updated, which is great. But there is some work required sometimes just to make sure that your own instance of Backstage stays up to date. The documentation is technically still under development. Generally, we've found it's quite good, but there have been a couple of spots where it's been a little bit patchy. And also, it's an open source project, so that comes with a generic disclaimer about any strings attached around that. So going back to our developers and their kind of experience, we're really just trying to get like the developers' experience, we call it back to basics, so that they can just go into Backstage, click create, set up a new project, a new repo straight away. They can then clone that locally, make whatever changes they need, then push those changes back up for GitHub to deploy. So GitHub will then immediately handle all of our deployments. And then developers can just go back to Backstage and check the state of their deployments and kind of just enjoy the new code that they've just pushed. So I'm going to give a quick demo now just to show kind of what this can look like. So this is our developer instance of Backstage. So I'm just going to go into create, and I've got one prepared. So if I want to create a new project, I'd go into the template in Backstage, and I'm just going to fill it in some details. I'm just going to call it test. And here you can select what team owns the new service as well. So we're just going to say the DevOps team owns it. And then when I click next step, it will let me just double check everything before I click create. And at this point, Backstage will then run. It will grab the template, which we've got stored in a repo somewhere else. It will then publish the kind of new templated service into GitHub, and then it will register the new entity it's created in Backstage itself. So if I now go and look at that entity, I can go here and we can look at the service. So we can see it's CI/CD. So we can see that the GitHub workflow has started running already. We can see some information about the API it provides. So this is the default API that comes with a new service. So you can click on it, see its definition. So definitions can be different types. So this is a GraphQL one. You can get open API ones, which look a bit nicer in Backstage at the moment. So if I go back to service, see some more information like any dependencies. So if it depends on any other components or any particular resources. And I can also see the documentation right here in Backstage as well. So if I click on here, I can go immediately to the GitHub workflow. So this is just a demo one, so it's run straight away very quickly. But this has the same structure as our main workflows. So you can see we're kind of running this build pipeline that does the tests before building if everything is okay. And then it will trigger any deployments that are required. And if I go back to actions, you can see the kind of different workflows we have on the left here. So you can see we're building it. And then if we go in here, you can see the deployment workflow. Now, if I want to trigger a workflow myself, I can just go on here and I can say, oh, deploy to a particular stage. So for us, that might be latest or production or so on. And then our build workflow. So in here, it has this trigger deployments, which would normally trigger this deployment in an actual use case. This is just a demo one, which is why it's not appearing at the moment. So that's it for the demo at the moment. So what next for Peak? Well, we're moving now from kind of like an initial rollout to more general use in our engineering team. So that includes us doing like a lot of knowledge shares because there's not much point rolling out new tools if developers don't know how to use them. So we've done a fair few knowledge shares already around how to add new plugins, how to register entities, how to use the templating, and we'll be doing more as we go forwards. We're also looking at doing a big rebranding of Backstage internally. So we've seen that some of the teams that have done best when adopting Backstage, particularly Splunk, have kind of really succeeded where they've kind of rebranded it and helped developers take ownership of Backstage and kind of make it their own. For example, Splunk renamed theirs Pink Phone Book and have a lot of very pink kind of branding around theirs. We're also going to be adding more templates to Backstage as well, so that developers can kind of automate as many of their tasks as possible through that UI that I've just shown you and through that workflow. And we'll be adding some new actions as well to kind of use during that templating process. So we can automate things like adding secrets to GitHub repos and things like that. And finally, once we're ready, we'd like to kind of contribute back to the Backstage community because they've been really great for us. So it'd be nice once our own instance is more matured that we can kind of share some of the stuff we've been working on as well. If you've really enjoyed this talk, then you can check out Backstage and GitHub Actions for yourself at those links. Backstage does have a publicly available kind of like demo instance that you can just go on straight away and start playing around with. We also have loads of opportunities available at Peak, so feel free to check out our careers page. And then on the 4th of November, we have our signature conference happening here in Manchester. So if you've really enjoyed what I've said today, feel free to come along, learn more about decision intelligence and kind of like our platform that we're rolling out. We've got some great speakers coming along, including Matthew Syed, author and former world #1 table tennis player, Christopher Wiley, Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, and Leanne Fitzpatrick, the head of data science at the Financial Times. It's going to be great fun. Hopefully see some of you there.